We affirm we offer the following framework: prioritize structural violence before all other frameworks. The threats they claim biometrics combat are manufactured to distract from structural violence. Lee and Shin 22 corroborate governments have a long history of collecting data from civilians, justifying the resulting loss of privacy in the name of societal benefits, disproportionately affecting communities of color. Surveillance tech enables more precise discrimination, especially as law enforcement agencies continue to make misinformed decisions around arrests and disproportionately impact marginalized populations. According to Winter and Lee in 1999, we draw conceptual lines between those who are in and out of our moral circle. Those who fall outside are morally excluded and become either invisible or demeaned in some way so that we do not have to acknowledge the injustice they suffer. Inclusion is thus a necessary prerequisite to all other ethical theories. We can't form or discuss moral theories until all parts of society are included in them. Structural violence is hidden and embedded, causing as much damage as direct violence. Winter and Lee in 1999 continue, explaining that structural violence is invisible, embedded in social structures, normalized by institutions and regular experience. Whenever people are disadvantaged by political, legal, economic, or cultural traditions, structural inequities usually seem ordinary but produce suffering and death as often as direct violence, though the damage is slower, more subtle, common, and difficult to repair. Addressing structural violence is necessary because it is exponential and a threat multiplier. Nixon 11 states, we need to engage in a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental. Such rethinking requires that we complicate conventional assumptions about violence as a highly visible act because it is event-focused, time-bound, and body-bound. Slow violence operates as a threat multiplying proliferating conflicts where the conditions for sustaining life become increasingly but gradually degraded. With that, C1 is policing. Today, in our post-COVID world, the use of biometrics by law enforcement has proliferated. Conway 22 corroborates tech created to help fight COVID, including facial recognition and other biometric scans, has been adopted by law enforcement around the world. Police are repurposing the huge amounts of sensitive biometric data that millions of people gave up freely in the early days of the pandemic. Unfortunately, this has resulted in mass incarceration. Hinton 21 finds, undergirding the rise of mass incarceration in America is surveillance of racialized individuals and communities. Law enforcement has mobilized new tech for police operations to monitor and contain people of color and low-income groups. Thus, biometrics empower police, facilitating their oppression of minorities. ACLU 20, adding tech to a broken and racist system, renders it a more efficient tool of oppression. Numerous studies have found that face recognition technology is flawed and biased, misidentifying Black and Asian people 100 times more than white people. Despite this, law enforcement agencies nationwide are using this tech in secret without democratic oversight. This means that others have been and will continue to be charged for crimes they didn't commit. Lee 22 furthers, facial recognition tech has drastically enlarged the precision and scope of potential surveillance, furthering historical biases affecting communities of color. This results in the militarization of police. While 13 writes, military aerial drones are now being repurposed as domestic security tech. Biometrics such as body scans, facial recognition systems, smart cards, national ID cards, and a plethora of others are currently deployed in both counterinsurgency and domestic policing operations, suggesting that these technologies never solely belong to the domestic order but to security and pacification. Thus, the impact is twofold versus police brutality. Nolan 20 writes, arming our police with more powerful weapons has led to more violence against Americans. Police are often taught to think like soldiers. The militarization of police departments is what has been a feature of U.S. domestic law enforcement since the 9/11 attacks. What is clear from the latest round of protests and response is that despite efforts to promote de-escalation as a policy, police culture appears to be stuck on an us versus them mentality. The message sent through equipping them with military equipment is that they are at war. This implies that there needs to be an enemy, increasingly perceived to be criminally inclined. Even after controlling for other possible factors in police violence, more militarized law enforcement agencies were associated with more civilians killed each year by police. The second impact is mass incarceration. DPA 15 corroborates consequences of mass incarceration, resulting in a lifelong ban on many aspects of social, economic, and political life, creating a second-class status for millions of Americans, disproportionately people of color. Weller et al. 22 finds households with an incarcerated family member have 50% less wealth than households not affected by incarceration and end up deeper in debt. 21.5% of households with an incarcerated family member had legal debt, compared to only 2.1% of households without an incarcerated family member. This affects minorities specifically. Weller et al. 22 continues, Black and Hispanic households have a fraction of the wealth of white households affected by incarceration. With that, I strongly urge a pro ballot.
Can we get a dog?
Yeah, disclose all the cards. If you want, like.
Oh, yeah, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Actually,
this is true because we disclosed like the first round we cut like 3 cards because it was a big so I guess is that what you're talking about? Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, for sure.
It's okay. We can just say it.
Once we get that all sorted.
I just have one.
I can begin.
Yeah.
All right. Is everyone good for constructive? For the judge, I'm Leonardo Gia, speaker. For for Saratoga, we are -7. Cool. Since everyone's ready, time starts. Now, really quickly on the framing, all are impacted about structural violence too, so we link into it. With that said, we negate contention what is trafficking. Biometrics are critical in the fight to end human trafficking. Zivo 19 writes, 45 million people are currently victims of human trafficking. The success of trafficking relies on masking the identity of victims. Trafficking victims need to be mobile so traffickers can transport their supply to where demand is. Traffickers work hard to erase identities of their victims. Forged documents are used to move victims across borders, and traffickers target those who lack documentation. Thankfully, Zivo argues biometrics can break apart trafficking networks, and biometric trafficking could prevent transportation of victims since traffickers aren't able to forge new documents with physical paperwork. A biometric file, even a partial one, can identify and rescue the victim. Biometric data can be shared easily between different investigative teams across various jurisdictions. Systems are entering these testing stage. Families upload photos of missing persons, which is then cross-referenced with photos from surveillance feeds. Having an active social media profile is sufficient to enroll someone into a tracking system that is particularly useful for rescuing youth. Contention 2 is curbing crime. Forensic fingerprinting would vanish in the act. J07 writes, biometric systems based on fingerprints were installed by law enforcement agencies 40 years back. Over time, for all at 19 finds, biometric forensic technologies continue to improve, which help prevent false convictions. Thus, affirming would send crime fighting back to the dark ages. Basuda finds that fingerprints have been the gold standard for the forensic community for over 100 years. No crime can be committed without the aid of hands. That spills over. Rebao 17 argues forensic intelligence efforts brings greater efficiency and robustness to justice procedures globally. Consolidation dramatically reduces error in crime investigations. Rain 16 writes, by deterring potential offenders from committing crimes and enabling law enforcement to zero in more efficiently, DNA profiling reduces the probability of future convictions by 17% for violent offenders. That's key. Reducing violent crime rates reduces structural poverty and inequality. Florida 17 argues violent crime has played a significant role in economic mobility facing disadvantaged communities. When violent crime falls, a kid's chances of moving up out of poverty begin to grow rapidly. High levels of violence cycle of decay and decline. Contention 3 is poverty. Supplement is CBDC. A central bank digital currency or CBDC is coming. Smith 23 writes, the fall of SB Bank could inject new impetus into the crossover of CBDCs. The Fed announced its FedNow service, and this could segue into the use of CBDC as a digital alternative to the fiat dollar. However, consumer buying is key, which biometrics bridge the gap. Flamingo 21 writes, only 54% of people would trust a digital currency issued by the central bank. The advantages offered by CBDCs will only be realized if consumers trust it. A cutting-edge approach to security will be critical, blending the highest levels of security with familiar payment experience. Biometrics maintain the growth rate of national digital currencies and earn the trust of consumers. The results could be CBDCs for all. Thus, Space Flight 23 concludes, in the near future, we can expect to see new advancement in technologies and the use of biometrics in digital currencies, and governments may require transactions to be validated using biometrics. The impact is recession. Harvard 21 explains the switch simplifies monetary policy. Central banks can immediately change supply and directly transfer to households instead of influencing behaviors indirectly. Iglesias 12 writes, a cashless economy could end recession. Preventing returns is crucial. Lawsuit quantifies 100 million people around the world fell into extreme poverty due to the crisis. Subway B is banking. RTech 22 reports people are unbanked for different reasons, the most common of which are a lack of proper ID and a lack of financial infrastructure. Fortunately, AirTech continues, biometrics provide means to usher millions into the financial fold. Using biometrics to make a digital ID system will solve the problem of not having identity documents to open a bank account. Additionally, AirTech explains many people don't have access to traditional banking services, but thanks to digital ID and biometric mobile devices, financial institutions can expand their service area and provide banking to more people. The rapid growth of biometrics means benefits will come soon. As Bert 19 writes, biometric authentication will be used in $2.5 trillion in mobile payments by 2024, an increase of 1,000% from 2019. June 21 confirms in the US, 700 more financial institutions adopted facial recognition as in the past year. Empirically, the World Bank 18 finds in India financial inclusion through biometric identification push the share up with an count with 8 to 80%. Region-wide, digitized payments could reduce the number of unbanked adults by 40 million. The impact is poverty. AirTech writes, since they can't save or borrow money, people who don't have bank accounts live in poverty. This is crucial as NPR 21 quantifies that 63 million Americans are either unbanked or underbanked. Poverty is a form of structural violence, as Rouse 12 writes, that people can be maldeveloped or deprived through violent economic structure. This has been called structural violence, and examples include people who live on less than $2 per day. Thus,
Ready for house?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll channel the first question.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's start in ready.
Yeah.
Let's start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's talk about trafficking a little bit. So, facial recognition technology bans have happened in the EU, right?
I think like there's a court ruling on this.
Yeah. Do human trafficking increase here?
Currently, it's sort of like it like just the fact that it's like identified. Also, like the EU stuff, it was like a court ruling saying like they don't really like facial recognition. I'm not sure if that's an all-out ban on like every single use of facial.
Sure. So, can I get a follow-up?
Sure.
Facial recognition has also like been regulated and banned on like municipal level. So, do you have any evidence that human trafficking worsened in any of those places?
Like in specific places, the key thing is most regulation right now has been like regulation instead of outright ban, right? Which means they're still able to use it.
Okay, but like we see that it's being banned, yet we don't see any
like if you want a generic crime statistic, like after New Orleans banned it, like crime went up 67%.
Okay, but I'd say like we should prefer like greater evidence.
Okay, sure. Let's go on to your. Okay, let's go on to this argument about mass incarceration, right?
Sure.
Recently, has mass incarceration been increasing or decreasing?
I'd say that mass incarceration will always increase when the police surveil to a greater extent.
But like right now, the status quo.
Okay, I mean, we'd say like if it's decreasing, I'd say correlation, not causation. But like what's most important is that whenever we see biometrics increasing, right? Whenever we see the use of biometrics increase and police have a better means of mass surveilling, we will always see more mass incarceration.
Okay, can I get a quick follow-up?
Yeah, for sure.
Can you name me one example of like banning like biometrics, like reducing mass incarceration?
Okay, I mean like I'd say like one thing that we see like time and time again is that when we have biometrics, we see incarceration go up. I'd say look at the empiric of like the 2020 BLM protests, right? We see biometrics being used. We see like incarceration rates go up because the police like increase their
Actually, over 2020, mass incarceration decreased.
Don't we see the police like one like acting out more, but like also like we see like net more violence, like net more arrests.
Yeah, the key thing there, right? For example, if you mentioned 2020, right? With the case of George Floyd, biometrics had like nothing to do with it, right?
It's
because of a lot of
other protests.
Yeah, we did protests, but like the thing with like George Floyd and like other like similar cases, right? Like
No,
biometrics.
not like that, not like the murder specifically. I'm talking about like the protests after.
Okay, yeah, the protests after, right? Like, what role did biometrics have in playing like with those?
That's a great question. Biometrics played a really big role in the police tracking down the people that were protesting peacefully. But then, like, can I get a question?
Sure.
Okay, like let's talk about like crypto a little bit. I guess like I'd ask, or like this CBDC argument, like I'd ask, like, let's say you use biometrics for like your banking argument, right? If you have your biometrics stolen, hacked, like how do you get them back?
That's the thing, right? It's a big if. Number one is the fact that biometrics are a lot more secure than passwords.
So we will never see a hack.
Yeah. Number one, they're a lot more secure because they're intrinsically connected to you, right? Number two, even if someone manages like, I don't know, make a copy of your facial recognition, right? They can't really access your account because of the fact that number one, biometrics just like kind of overlap with current authentication. And number two is the fact that they have to actually have like physical.
Sure. So if that's true, we have to find it. Like there will be no like sacrifice.
No, like it just has to be less than the sacrifice. Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm ready to go. Do you want to talk?
It's gonna be like faster.
It probably won't be that fast. I'll just send the cards.
Yeah.
Any tags or warrants aren't necessarily going to be what's.
Yeah.
Do you want to wait until you get it to start? Or,
You can just start.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So with that, unless anybody is not ready for me to begin, I'll start my time in 3, 2, 1. Start on human trafficking. At the top, make them provide you some historical precedents. The resolution we are debating today is somewhat vague. That means that when we interpret the resolution, it's best to look at the history of official recognition technology. Insofar as that's true, we'd say that A, there have already been municipal bans and regulation of facial recognition domestically within the EU, US, and that the EU had a court ruling banning facial recognition technology. The fact that their arguments talk about the benefits of the technology generally without providing any evidence that says that in any of the instances it was actually banned, there was an increase in human trafficking, means that their argument is very improbable, because if we have had bans and regulation on a technology already and their impact hasn't materialized, it's super improbable that just because the wording of the resolution is a little bit different, the impact suddenly materialized in a way that's completely different. But second, we would turn the argument because we would say that biometrics are being implemented poorly, which makes our ability to fight all forms of crime, including human trafficking, worse. Lynch in 18 explains that the adoption of face recognition technologies like these is occurring without meaningful oversight, without the enactment of legal protections to prevent internal and external misuse. This has led to the development of unproven, inaccurate systems that will impinge on constitutional rights. It could be relatively easy for the private companies and to use databases to identify and track people in real time as they move from place to place. That means that police and law enforcement gets a whole lot lazier in their world because they enable the police to do things which are not really in the interest of tracking down human traffickers. If they make law enforcement less responsible, that makes them inherently less capable to fight things like human trafficking. First, then go to their argument about law enforcement. At the top, cross-apply that response. If we've seen facial recognition technology be used by police already, and the way it's used is A, not regulated, and B, used irresponsibly by the police, then you're always buying it works in a really bad way. We don't have to speculate about the effects it has on law enforcement because we've already seen them use it badly. But second, we would say that the way biometrics is used by law enforcement is getting worse and worse over time. For example, in states like Florida, biometrics have already started to erase probable cause. Garvey et al. In 16 explains that FACES users weren't required to have reasonable suspicion to run a search. The manual encourages officers to use biometric identification, quote, whenever practical. At the point, we would say that that makes police officers way more interested in just trying to get the most arrests as necessary without actually looking to solve crime or police in a responsible way. You're giving a body that is as irresponsible as our case proves they are, like the police, the capacity to do the maximum amount of damage, which makes policing a whole lot worse. Then, let's go to their third contention. Cross-apply group responses here. All of their arguments are contingent on the idea that biometrics are somehow inherently a more stable way of doing things than the status quo, but that's not true. Biometrics are entirely hackable, and hacks will increase over time as there's a black market for the information. SACE No Date explains that a fingerprint can be stolen, copied, and molded onto an artificial silicon finger. This can be used to unlock a mobile device or payment system, allowing hackers to access the user's bank account. Facial recognition systems often are used to secure smartphones or tablets and have been known to be vulnerable to simply being shown a photograph of the owner, thus unlocking the device. For sale on the black market to counterfeit drug traffickers, an industry worth an estimated $75 billion annually, the potential for biocrime grows. But second, we would say that the biometric data collections are always susceptible to leaks. Porter 19 explains that a huge cache of unsecured biometric credentials and personal information has been discovered. The breach included the fingerprint data of more than 1 million people. Cut it there. Lastly, their argument is that biometrics have got hacked less. We would say that efforts by hackers increase in the long run, which means the security of their technology gets worse. Miriam in 18 explains that hackers are refocusing their attention, creating an uptick in attacks against touchscreen, facial recognition, and passcodes. Those are among the top 5 data breach trends for the past year. Their argument fails on time frame. Biometric recognition data is relatively new, which is why there have been less hacks, but as time progresses, the hacks always increase. Cut the next card. On weighing, our arguments are better than both of their arguments about banking for 2 reasons. First is that they link into consumer buy-in. We would say that even if in the short term the central banking systems were implicated, in the long run the technology takes itself out. That's because if there's a centralized banking system and we see irreversible fraud harming consumers, then the argument is always going to turn against itself because banking security gets a lot worse.
I didn't get a doc. I just got another link to your case.
Wait, no, there's an email. There's a Zoom email.
Oh, there's an email?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Makes more sense.
We'll use some. Yeah, let's start.
Oh, sorry, I didn't read. I don't know if you want to pause prep.
Yeah.
My bad. I didn't read like Hey 18. I didn't read this.
It's like the last one, right?
Yeah, I didn't read that.
Okay, cool. Gotcha. We'll continue.
Sorry, real quick before you talk for the rest.
Yeah.
Good. Cool. I just sent out the doc. It's rhetoric at the top, cards at the bottom. Nothing's paraphrased. Is anyone not ready? Wait, actually. Okay.
You need your phone.
Oh, yeah. Is everyone good? Good?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's just frontlining with their case. Since everyone's ready, time will begin on my first word. At the top of our case where they read historical precedent, that's an egregious double standard. They need to prove that bans work as well. Then they read you this turnabout how biometrics are bad because there's no oversight. Label 20 writes that requiring a warrant to use biometrics may soon be required by the Supreme Court as the court recognized technological intrusions on privacy as an important value of the Fourth Amendment. Justice Roberts and several justices agree complete prohibition on biometric tech overreacts and tosses the baby out with the bathwater. Requiring a warrant stops indiscriminate applications while keeping it available to help catch criminals. This postdates their evidence about oversight not being there, meaning that our uniqueness is much better, but also it makes no sense about how law enforcement becomes lazier. If anything, if law enforcement becomes lazier, it takes out their own link about over-policing because it means that cops don't have any incentive to catch criminals, but that's not even true because cops get their funding based on proving their efficacy, meaning that cops always have an incentive to make sure they're solving crime. On our crime argument, they just cross-apply more responses here, but Mertz 22 finds that biometrics are actually accurate compared to what they say. Specifically, Mertz writes that 2022 legislation requires that police only use facial recognition software that has been deemed at least 98% accurate, which solves back for all of the harms they talk about. But then They also read that Florida had like the death of probable cause. That probably happens in either world. They have no warranty whatsoever as to why biometrics are uniquely the reason why probable cause dies. On the argument about digital banking, they tell you that like, oh, hacks happen. The first thing is that passwords are much worse. NEC 21 finds that passwords are 80% of hacks, and moreover, their own evidence they sent in the doc says that hacks on passcodes are increasing in the status quo. But even if biometrics are hacked, the big thing to note is that number one, in order to use the biometric data you have hacked, you have to actually be there to use it. You have to be there to use the fingerprint on the phone. But secondly, finally, they read you this link in on like consumer tech and like how it's bad. No, our link on consumer tech is perceptual. When consumers feel that CBDCs are safe through biometrics, that's when they adopt it. Also, the second subpoint on like digital banking infrastructure is completely conceded. It's a great place to vote. On their argument, at the top, turn it because of worse surveillance. Thomas 19 writes that more intrusive methods are being developed. FRT is the tip of the iceberg. If strict regulation is brought in, we simply switch to other forms that are more invasive than biometrics. Trying to regulate surveillance tech is futile. The industry is developing too fast, and it is easy to switch from one surveillance to another. Two implications: at best, it turns case because surveillance in their world is net worse and more intrusive, leading to more over-policing. At worst, it's a terminal non-unique. Surveillance exists in either world, which is just as bad. And there's still the same amount of over-policing, which at that point you default to our biometric-specific arguments, especially at the point where their own link evidence is talking about surveillance in general. Secondly, McLaughlin 20, algorithms do not display a demographic bias. False positive demographic differentials were undetectable. Black men had lower false negative rates, had better false negative rates for white women than white men. Some algorithms perform differently on one group but still maintain accuracy rates greater than 99% for all races and sexes. The implication is because biometrics are so accurate, even if there are slight differences in accuracy between demographics, it's statistically insignificant. Anyway, thirdly, turn the argument because of China and Russia. Baker 22 warns that time detect accusations of racism made the technology toxic. Departures have left the market to Chinese and Russian companies. This outweighs their link on scope because China and Russia export the tech for authoritarian surveillance, which supercharges their link at a global level, which is on net worse, but also on probability. Baker concludes that just the threat of a ban has already caused U.S. companies to leave the market. But fourth, turn it again because of alternatives. Bombardier 21 finds that the risks of facial recognition are less bad than the options police have without it. Bombardier continues FRT is more valuable than average surveillance because they rely on limited amounts of discretion. Because police start with photographic evidence, they decrease bias in investigation. This outweighs their case on a risk of offense. The police are always going to target minorities according to their own analysis that the police are racist, but more biased tech in the app world is much worse. Turn it again because of a human bias. Huntley 13 warns that there should be statistically significant negative correlations between biometric systems and complaints about racial targeting. A major purpose is to remove human bias to fight discrimination. This prereqs their case because you can't solve predictive policing if you have people that are biased in the first place. Then skip the sixth response. The status quo is solving because of quality control. SIA 19 writes that FRT does not make a final match and cannot identify a person as someone they are not. In all known US use cases, a facial recognition search is just one part of an ID process. The implication is that just banning biometrics doesn't give them solvency for their entire impact. Then on their impacts, first on the militarization of the police, 1033 and 1122 programs during the war on drugs caused the police to become more militarized, and Shook finds that the American criminal justice system has become more equitable as the racial gap among inmates in prison has fallen 40% since 2000, fueled by a large decrease in black imprisonment rates. Even with the rise of biometrics, mass incarceration has fallen, meaning their impacts are minuscule effects.
Okay. Do you want me to send the copy of the rebuttal doc without like stuff you did?
I would have. It seemed like it was like wait, was it just like one or two things? It seemed like it was
one, two.
Yeah, can you just send
Okay, in that case, you did, yeah.
Okay.
And then I'm good with cross.
Got it. Did you read Hussein?
Oh yeah, he also.
Okay.
I can. You can do.
Okay. Are you going to take cut or do you want to do cross?
I'm going to do cross.
Okay. Yeah, and my partner's sending more.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, you can get the first question.
Okay. So I want to talk about this argument about the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So our argument in case and also on your case doesn't ever say that it's unconstitutional. The argument is just that it's like bad. So my question is, why does the fact that the Supreme Court supports the technology and says that banning it is like not related to constitutionality or whatever, what does that have to do with whether or not it actually like worsens mass incarceration?
Yeah, so it's about to do with your argument about like probable cause, right? If the Supreme Court is saying that you do need probable cause in order to use the technology, right?
Right.
That's the uniqueness that they're shifting to do. That solves back for all of your link evidence and like this response.
Okay. So if probable cause is being erased and like this incredibly conservative Supreme Court is supporting the erasure of probable cause and the Fourth Amendment, how is that good?
Okay, first of all, that's not what the evidence is saying. The evidence
just says the justices support it. Why is it good or not an invasion of privacy just because the justices support it?
Yeah, because the evidence says specifically that Supreme Court justices want to make sure that biometrics are being used with a warrant. That's what the Claypool evidence says explicitly.
The Claypool evidence just says that they think that it would be, quote, an overreaction to ban biometrics, but that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not, like, the mass incarceration that results from it is bad. But you can take it.
Okay, yeah, we've read plenty of answers. On your case, let's talk about this idea that, like, the police become militarized, right? So when did the war on drugs start?
The war on drugs, I would say it started during the Reagan administration.
During the Reagan administration. Yeah. What happened during the war on drugs?
Police officers, a number of things happened. Yeah. Police officers increased surveillance on communities, drug to and arrest for things like nonviolent drug charges, which actually increased the amount of drug trafficking there was more violence.
Isn't it also true that during the war on drugs, the police got access to more militarized technology through things like the 1033 and 1122 programs?
Yeah, we wouldn't contest that.
You wouldn't contest that. So that means that there are like plenty of alt causes as to why the police become more militarized as opposed to like solely biometric tech, right?
I mean, first of all, I would say that even if that's true, our impact calc initially wasn't assuming police aren't bound to status quo. But second, I think that that's kind of like a kind of poor way of addressing what our argument is, because our argument about militarization is at least really importantly for impact calculus, that if you buy that the police are really militarized, that means that the impact of mass policing is really bad, because when you give a militarized force the ability to mass surveil a group of people in a way that is fundamentally unprecedented. You argue surveillance is not unique, the ability that when they have the capacity to surveil in a way that's unprecedented, violence gets worse.
So the argument is that the police are already militarized, it's just that giving them surveillance.
Well, militarization is also part of the way they get biometrics, because since police get their technology from the military and the military uses biometrics, there's a proliferation of the amount of biometrics that are used by the police. That's the link from case.
Okay, you can get a question.
We have a little bit of time left. How's your day going?
Decent.
Okay, cool.
Okay, we're gonna take that. Let's start. 3, 2, 1. Start on policing. First on like this Russia and China response, the turn doesn't apply at all. Russia and China won't ever mass incarcerate people, so this is like an implicated, independent, and dissat at worst. But then like let's look at the response that like the system can be improved and still use biometrics. A few things here. One, non-unique biometrics have been extensively used for years, and there has never been effective limitations to misconduct in policing. Don't buy that there will suddenly be a magical change when we don't see it already happening. But even if you want to buy that it is, which you shouldn't, it'll still occur in a world without biometrics. At that point, the only uniqueness in the run is preventing corruption, which happens when you affirm there's absolutely no uniqueness. That's why 2, no link. We aren't seeing any changes made that are resulting in effective improvements in the system. As long as we still see corruption in the status quo, there's no link. But then 3, mitigate, make them prove that biometrics are quantifiably improving in the status quo and are currently resulting in a non-corrupt system. Otherwise, prefer our narrative if we want the system to actually improve. But 4, turn it, the system can't be improved as long as we have biometrics, because police will always use bias with or without unbiased technology. The problem is that once they have biometrics, mass surveillance can be used however they see fit, drastically increasing the net amount of surveillance and violence that occurs. But then let's go to their case. Let's start on their C1. Like extend that we've seen biometrics get banned and regulated already, but like we've never seen that materialize in like an increase in trafficking. At the end of the round, they'll never win this because we'll tell you because they can't tell you how biometric bans have produced like a harm you don't buy it happens. And then 2, like extend the lynch card that Dash reads you rebuttal. If you buy that biometrics are being used poorly, that means that they do a really bad job stopping human trafficking, which is Dash's warrant in rebuttal that they completely drop. But then on their C2, at the top, like they read this front line, the Supreme Court is good, but like a couple things. One, like just because the Supreme Court supports it doesn't mean that it's good. Our evidence is very like specific. Probable cause standards are being raised by biometrics, but 2, they say that probable cause is non-unique. That doesn't that probable cause also is non-unique, but that doesn't respond to our argument at all. Like we would say that the impact is always the worst in their world because the erasure is caused by biometrics per our Garabee analysis. That's completely unique to our side. But then like go onto their C2, we're on our C2. But then like we'd also say like on this like biometrics like essential to solving crime, like 1, non-unique crime can be solved effectively without harmful tech with biometrics that hurt minorities. 2, like no link. The statistics they read are very misleading. The usage of biometrics doesn't actually solve crime the way they says it does. Therefore 3, mitigate. In reality, the amounts of crime solved do not significantly change. At the point, you'll always buy that. 4, in turn, an increase in biometrics leads to mass incarceration because giving a corrupt access to easily mass surveillance results in a damaged system. At the point that we link into generational poverty and disenfranchisement, negating only causes way more crime. But then like on their C3, they say, like my partner said group responses, they say that we clean can see that, but that's just like not true. Check your flow. At this point, we don't get any responses, so it'll be very easy for you to vote for us here. But that's why you can extend 1, biometric black market is profitable and incentivizes hackers to steal sensitive information. 2, biometric data collection are way more susceptible to leaks. It's no better than regular protection. That's why 3, turn it. We see hacks increasing in the long run. It only gets worse. But then remember, the Inspire's biometrics cannot be reversed. It's always going to be way worse in their world when we see hacks as opposed to non-biometric data that can be replaced. But then like let's go to weighing. The weighing turns their case because if they destroy the security of financial exchanges, resulting in the loss of data, which is permanent in their world, because biometrics cannot be released, they make up all of the economic systems. They talk about a lot less here.
All right, we have a minute 15 remaining.
Yeah.
Let's run it now. That's 55 seconds, so we have 27 minutes. Is everyone good for summary? Cool. For the judge, it's going to go down the weighing, then our case. Let's start time. Now, our C3 pre-regs their argument because of one simple reason. Whenever police over police poor communities because of the fact that they perceive these communities as having more crime, this means that solving poverty as per our C3 is a prerequisite to having reduced mass incarceration and reduced police brutality. This also outweighs on scope to their link because of the fact that poverty is intergenerational, while they haven't proved a single example of how biometric, like arresting people, is intergenerational. Then, with that said, quickly onto their weighing on the turn, it's just it's not even a wing. They just say that like destroying the security of financial exchanges means that it takes out our case. Once again, I'll get to that on like the bottom of our case. But in addition to this, it doesn't because of the fact that financial exchanges have existed for a long time and biometrics have existed for a long time too. It's empirically not true. Then go to our case. Quickly on the first turn on trafficking, they just say biometrics are used poorly. Number one, we already proved to you that the Supreme Court is going to require a warrant for the use of biometrics. It's not going to be used poorly. Number two, because of the fact that biometrics are so accurate, they don't give a single warrant why they're used poorly. We give contextualization. Basically, they can identify these traffickers. Like, it's a really terrible response here. Then they also talk about this turn about mass incarceration. That's a cross-up of their case. We'll get to it on their case. Then with that said, extend our C3 subpoint V on banking. What we explained to you is that banking is going to be improved with biometrics because of the fact that biometrics are able to enable digital ID for those who don't have ID documents and provide mobile digital banking infrastructure, which allows people to be financially included, which pulls 60 million people in America who are currently underbanked or unbanked out of poverty. They say a few things. First, they say biometrics can be hacked. Number one, they never prove that it's worse than passwords. We give you evidence from NEC 21 explaining that 80% of cyber breaches are passwords. On net, we're still a net improvement. We're the only team that does a comparative. Then they say it can be leaked. Once again, they don't do any comparison here. It's much harder to leak biometrics and passwords because the fact that for passwords, all you need is an algorithm and some good coding knowledge, but the fact that biometrics are intrinsically you means it's much harder to be hacked. That's why they have no comparative. Then they say hacks are increasing in the long run. Their own evidence is hacks against passcodes are increasing too. It's completely non-unique. Then they say it can't be reversed once it's hacked. Once again, it can. Number one, the fact that it hasn't caused any big damage means that it hasn't been hacked yet. Number two is the fact that you have to be physically present in order to actually hack it and then be able to do something with that new identity. That means that even if they're able to hack it, because they're not physically present, that means it's still secure. Then that's why in India here it proves that digitalizing payments reduce 40 million people out of poverty. This bring the clash here on appearance. Finally, they talk about the disruption of security and financial exchanges. Once again, since hacks have empirically not happened, that means that they don't access this term. Then let's go into their case. Number one, there's a few things to remember. Number one is the biggest thing, which is that police are always going to target these communities like minorities. That's their literally warrant. That means you can extend a few responses. Number one is that all surveillance exists, such as per Thomas evidence, which explains to you that more intrusive methods of surveillance, such as Wi-Fi and Stingray, are going to exist and take over when biometrics are banned. This means that all the impacts are magnified because they over-surveil minorities even more, and it's more intrusive, which means there's even more surveillance. Then you can turn it again because of human bias, or how the evidence indicates that biometrics reduce the human bias from comparing images that police gain from whenever they arrest people. This means that because police are inherently racist, it's better for a computer to identify people rather than the police doing it. Then let's send the China turn, which explains to you that China and Russia are exporting tech, and they're going to export tech more when the U.S. bans biometrics. This is on net worth. They just say China and Russia aren't doing mass incarceration. Look at what the Uyghurs are happening in China. They are literally. All right. Yeah. Next valid. Yeah. You can first question.
Yeah. So, yeah, I want to start with your C3. You concede that hacks for both increase. Does that mean that you concede that in the long run, the hacks for biometrics will increase, or to put it in another way, if you're saying that if you concede at least the part of it that says that the hacking for the hacking of biometric data is increasing the status quo and that isn't contested, what's the benefit of the technology?
Yeah, once again, it's the fact that we are the only team that does a comparative between biometrics and passwords, right? Passwords are much easier to hack, right? Okay, passwords currently represent 80% of cyber breaches. They're much easier to be hacked because of the fact that hackers have found out specific algorithms which just test a bunch of passwords, right?
That's why you would agree that when biometrics are hacked, it's more disruptive.
No.
Why not?
Yeah. In every single speech, you have conceded that even if biometrics are hacked, in order for me to use that hacked data, I have to be physically present at the biometric sensor, right? Take, for example, my facial recognition. Let's look at fingerprint scanners, right? Let's say somehow a hacker gets my fingerprint from some database. How can that be used to destroy and wreck my identity? Well, that person hacking me has to be physically present at the biometric sensor in order to input my fingerprint. That is something that is very
I mean, Porter also explains pictures. If you what I read in rebuttal is Porter explains that biometric sensors currently literally you can hold up a picture to a biometric sensor of somebody else and that'll work. So you don't have to be physically present.
Really quickly,
that can happen with that can happen with a Venmo.
Yeah, cool. Right. Both of us are arguing different things, and there's been a lot of clash. The way you break the clash in my last speech that I mentioned is you conceded empirically on India. Empirically in India, when they introduced digitalized payments, they saw financial inclusion. They didn't see a bunch of hacks causing the disruption of financial institutions. It's pretty clear that these hacks are very rare and they don't do it.
You can take a question. We'll contest that.
Cool. Ashik, do you have one?
no, you can.
All right, let's go on to this argument about. Okay, yeah, sure. First, let's go into this argument about biometrics being used poorly, right? So if I am able to take a fingerprint at a crime scene, and then run it through my scanners and identify who caused the crime. Why is that like me doing a poor job?
That's not the argument that like we've been making throughout the round, though. It's not like biometrics are when police use fingerprints. The arguments are like, for example, with like data collected by the government throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, there's like currently millions and millions of Americans in police databases which they can automatically scan without any probable cause standard. That's what causes the harm, because it means there's more like incarceration for things like nonviolent drug charges, which produces cyclical.
Like at the point that we agree that like the police are a corrupt system, as long as you're giving them like a really powerful tool like biometrics, which facilitates like their corruption, we're always going to be seeing like large mass incarceration, which is always going to be like really detrimental.
Wait, okay, but like the thing is, like how exactly does it make them like lazier? Because that's a term you use, right? You say that like, oh, once they get biometrics, they're gonna be lazier.
We're just
That was
saying
on your
that, like,
case about trafficking.
Yeah.
Like, they would be worse at fighting things like trafficking.
Okay, sure, that's fine.
Okay. So, okay. Should we have pretty standard? Actually, no, one thing. So I'm gonna, it's gonna be their third contention, and then I'm gonna do the policing stuff from both cases together, and wait there. So I'll start time in 3, 2, 1. Sorry, I started my timer now. 3, 2, 1. Both of their arguments about finance rely on the idea that biometrics are long-term more secure. Well, they've conceded our analysis, which says that the top trends of security now are that hackers are increasing their efforts to hack biometrics, which means the extent to which it happens just increases. That means that even if you bought 100% of their argument, it gets taken out of the long term, which means that you shouldn't buy it. Also, they don't extend any implications for linking it to structural violence, so per their framing, it's really not a great reason to vote for them. They can basically just concede the defense that hacking is increasing when they say that hacks for both are increasing. But our argument isn't that biometrics are less secure than traditional securitization. It's that when biometrics are lost, that produces a bigger detriment. The warrant, basically, you could do one of two things with this argument at the end of the round. Because they concede the defense, you can either throw it away and not use it as a reason to vote for either side, or you can look at the fact that it's not reversible when biometric data is lost, because it gives hackers the ability to continue infinitely abusing the fraud that they're committing with something like someone's fingerprint, which can't be replaced or corrected the same way a password can, per the warrant I give you in rebuttal, and say that the harm is worse in their world, which is a reason to vote for us. Grouped both of our policing cases. They extend this argument that humans are less biased, but this was never our argument. If you want to actually do the comparative between both policing cases, extend a few things. One, extend our argument about probable cause. Police are always worse and more corrupt without it. They never actually respond to the example about Florida. They just say that the Supreme Court supports it. We would say we're not saying that the problem is that it's not consistent with the legal system. We're saying the problem is that it is. The problem is that at this point, our law enforcement systems are moving away from things like protections of the Fourth Amendment, which make security for all Americans worse. At that point, when you're doing the comparative, the biggest difference between our two worlds is that in our world, the police are less powerful. That's why you're always voting for us. Because if we can take the most powerful tool for mass surveillance the police have ever known away from them, that gives us the best shot at reducing cyclical poverty, which in this incredibly messy round is the best offense left. That's why we're so proud to affirm. Thank you for your time.
All right, we got 20 seconds left.
Yeah.
Let's use that.
Okay, that's fine. Is anyone not ready? Okay. The order will be starting off on the wing debate. I'll be going on to our case and then my opponent's case. Start on the wing debate. Remember what Leo tells you. Our impact about poverty is a link into structural violence because it's intergenerational. Even then, they also concede the prerequisite that the reason why over-policing happens is because poorer communities are perceived to have more crime, which is why over-policing happens. We're operating at a fundamentally higher layer of the debate. Let's look to our case. Our argument about banking is simple. What we tell you is that biometrics help expand digital banking infrastructure to communities which have been historically locked out of the financial system in America. That's really key because roughly 60 million Americans are underbanked or unbanked in the first place, and allowing for biometrics to continue and integrate these people into the financial system would help pull them out of poverty, increasing financial inclusion, which is also linking to structural violence. Onto the issue of hacks. We agree, sure, hacks might happen in the future. What they have conceded is that hacks are useless because in order to use hacked biometric data, you have to be physically present at the sensor. That gets lost throughout this entire debate. Now, because there's a lot of clash going back and forth, you need a way to break the clash. Leo does that for you, and so does our India empiric. We find that historically, digital banking infrastructure in India through biometrics lifted 40 million people out of poverty, meaning that hacks had no effect at best, meaning we're still winning some level of offense. Go to their argument about like the Fourth Amendment. What loses them the round is the Thomas evidence. The turn on Thomas is really clean. It tells you that when you ban biometrics, it forces that police to go to more intrusive and worse forms of surveillance like stingrays and Wi-Fi surveillance, which amplifies their link and outweighs it on magnitude because it means that more over-policing is happening and the police get a much larger weapon in order to surveil the population, which is much worse. This gets conceded in every single speech. You're voting for us here. But they also concede the turn that China and Russia are able to export their technology if we ban biometrics because American companies can't compete. And that's really key because when they're able to export their authoritarian tech, over-policing and other forms of surveillance happens in these nations, which is on net much worse. This is empirically proven with the Uyghur genocide. They have no responses here. What again? Yet again, meaning you're like voting for us no matter where you're looking on the floor.
Good round.
Yeah, good
Good
round.
round, y'all.